Leslie Vaughn was one of the best defense lawyers in all of San Antonio, Texas. He was described by friends and colleagues as a workaholic who was also a bit of a perfectionist, which, as far as defense attorneys go, that's the kind of guy that you want on your side. But because he was a defense attorney, that meant that a lot of his clients were the type of people you describe as from the wrong side of the tracks. They were often involved with dangerous activities like dealing, theft, and were members of local organized crime groups. Leslie's wife was a nurse, and on the night of November 10th, 1998, she was working her shift at the local hospital while Leslie and his two younger sons were at home. At around 1:30 in the morning, 16-year-old Brian Vaughn heard a loud bang that sounded like it came from his dad's bedroom upstairs. Brian bolted up the stairs, but when he tried to open up the door to the bedroom, he found it was locked. He could hear his dad's shallow breaths and some scary gurgling noises from inside and knew something was wrong, so he ran to the phone to call 911. Frantically, he told the operator that he had heard a loud sound from his dad's bedroom and that he couldn't get in the door, but he believed someone had just fired at his dad. Brian grabbed his 11-year-old brother's hand and walked him next door to their neighbors, terrified the person could still be in the house. When paramedics arrived, they broke down the door to discover the lifeless body of Leslie Vaughn lying face down in his bed. The investigators found a large rock on the floor and saw it had been thrown through the window of one of the French doors to the balcony. The doors to the balcony were made almost entirely of glass, and the hole that was shattered in one of the doors was big enough for a grown adult to pass through. A spent shell casing was found in the corner of the room on the floor, and they determined it had come from a 9mm semi-automatic, the same one that put the hole in Leslie's head. But as they looked around at the scene, they were having trouble coming up with a motive right away. It didn't appear like any of his things had been touched or gone through, so they didn't think that their suspect was motivated by money or valuables. The investigators' first instincts were that it was a hit job. Just a few days earlier, a federal prosecutor recalled hearing Leslie say that he was worried he would be a target for violence one day. He said it was just part of the risk you took when losing a case for your client who was a career criminal. His friends also believed it was a hit job from an old client, but when detectives called Leslie's wife to inform her of what had happened, she was shocked, but didn't really react the way the investigators expected her to. Unfortunately, one of the worst parts of the job as an investigator is having to break the news to a loved one that the worst possible thing that could happen has actually happened. But Madeline's reaction upon hearing the news struck them as odd. It wasn't something she said, it was something that she didn't say. After breaking tragic news like this hundreds of times before, the investigators were used to a typical protocol of how people reacted. Obviously, there's the initial gasp after telling them that their loved one's body had been found, but there's always one question that people ask immediately that Madeline didn't ask, is what happened? She didn't ask what happened or how it happened and never did during the call. And that was very suspicious. But just because she didn't ask them what happened, did that mean that she was somehow involved? Or was her reaction just because she was too shocked to speak and even form words? At Leslie's funeral, felons and thugs sat shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement and government officials and wept for the man they were laying to rest. It was clear that no matter who you were in life, Leslie treated you with the same amount of respect as anybody else. To see hardened criminals break down in tears and mourn Leslie Vaughn was a really incredible and beautiful moment to have come out of such a horrific tragedy. But whoever had pulled the trigger on Leslie was still at large, and investigators didn't know it at the time. But he was actually sitting in attendance at his funeral. Police were informed by the Vaughns that they had been getting these weird prank phone calls at their house in the weeks leading up to the attack, and wondered if they had something to do with it. They said that whenever they answered these phone calls, they could hear only silence on the other end. They looked into the phone records and saw the calls, but couldn't determine the number that had placed them. So with no new leads to follow, the investigators focused on trying to eliminate Leslie's wife, Madeline, as a suspect. Madeline's alibi was that she had been at the hospital the whole night, and multiple witnesses confirmed it. By now, Madeline had processed her shock and had become the grieving widow, and authorities no longer suspected her. Friends also testified that Leslie and Madeline were madly in love, and that the two led happy lives together, and rarely ever disagreed or fought. This was not a case of a toxic couple or a cheating spouse. The next suspect that they needed to rule out was Brian Vaughn, since he had been in the house at the time of the incident, and obviously, they didn't have much suspicion on his 11-year-old brother because, kids. On the night of the crime, detectives swabbed Brian's hands for traces of gunpowder residue, as was protocol with him being in the house when the crime occurred. When they put the sample under the microscope, Brian's hand came back negative for traces of residue, so he was looking less like a suspect as well. Investigators theorized that their intruders somehow scaled their way up to the balcony, broken through the French doors, then popped Leslie in the head with a round from the 9mm. There was no other way to access the balcony except through those French doors on the second floor, and the balcony was 15 feet up. That's quite high. That meant that their intruder had to have been a skilled athlete and in incredible physical shape in order to climb up. Now, investigators thought it could technically be done. They ran into trouble when they couldn't find any traces of a ladder or even footprints in the dirt below the balcony, despite the fact that there had been 3 days of constant rain, and the suspect's tracks would have definitely been left in the mud. They also realized how impossible it would have been for someone to have thrown the limestone rock from the yard. Then detectives found another inconsistency at the crime scene. Crime scene photos showed broken glass all over the bedroom floor and all over Leslie's body, but there was no sign that when the rock flew through the window that Leslie had even stirred or tried to brush the glass off of him. They were forced to conclude that Leslie was probably already gone by the time that the rock was thrown through the glass door. Clearly, this was an attempted cover-up. Toxicology reports also showed no substances found in Leslie's system, so there was no evidence that he'd been unconscious before he was slain either. So the investigators sent the rock to forensic labs for testing to see if they could pull any fingerprints off of it. Unfortunately, the surface of the rock was too jagged for them to successfully lift any prints. Then, investigators found an inconsistency in Brian Vaughn's story. Brian called 911 at 1:46 a.m. to report the loud bang that he heard at 1:30. He told the operator on the phone that he had taken his brother to his neighbor's house for safety, but the neighbors told the investigators that Brian had shown up at their house with his little brother at 1:24 that morning. First question you ask when someone knocks on your door in the middle of the night is, what time is it? So Brian arrived at his neighbor's house at 1:24 in the morning, but waited to place the phone call until 1:46. A background check showed that Brian had a previous arrest. He once got into an argument with a security officer at a bowling alley who had just so happened to be an off-duty deputy sheriff. Things got heated, and Brian ended up striking the officer at the bowling alley and running off. See what I did there? Officials also learned that Brian's car had caught fire just 3 months earlier. According to some rumors, Brian wanted a new car and had asked his dad for one. But when his dad said no, conveniently, Brian's car went up in flames. Whether Leslie suspected if his son was behind the fire or not is unknown, but he did offer to buy Brian a used car to replace the old one. But apparently Brian was so upset because he wanted a new car. And a car salesman informed police about a heated argument that Brian and Leslie had had on the lot the day of the crime. And now the investigators were seriously starting to wonder, no, a car? Could that seriously be the motive? Brian's grades were slipping, which was the reason Leslie wouldn't buy him a new car. And according to the younger brother, Chris, the argument had continued well after the two had gotten home that night. Chris remembered his brother threatening to quit the basketball team, which would lose him any chance of getting a scholarship for college. He said the two were in Brian's bedroom and were still fighting around 11:30 that night. Investigators dusted every inch of the master bedroom for any foreign fingerprints, but only found prints from the family members. But on the French doors and the broken window, investigators found only one set of fingerprints belonging to Brian. They also found shards of glass leading down the bedroom hallway. Detectives then Hansel and Gretel the glass all the way down to the bathroom, where they found more broken shards and 2 hairs in the bathroom sink. That, of course, belonged to Brian. But the thing is, Brian lived in the house, so of course his fingerprints and hair would be all over the place. Investigators would have to find another way to prove he was guilty. They decided to listen to the full recording of the 911 call on the night of the crime. In doing so, they realized that Brian had made one grave error when talking to the operator and gave himself away within seconds. Here's word for word how the call went down. I think my dad's been shot. I'm calling him, but there's no answer. He's bleeding around his mouth area.
Okay, so did you go inside the bedroom?
I can't. The door's locked.
Okay, so how do you know that he's bleeding from his mouth area?
A shot rang out in the room.
Okay, you're going to tell me you can't get into the bedroom, right?
I can't. I cannot get into the bedroom. The door's locked.
So how do you know that he's bleeding from the mouth?
I don't know that. The biggest evidence against Brian Vaughn was Brian Vaughn. From what Leslie's friend told them, Leslie kept a small firearm in his nightstand, and on the night he was attacked, the case that usually held it was empty. However, the 9mm has never been found. So investigators suspected Brian used the 9mm to take out his father. They just didn't know where he put it after the fact. The investigators then asked 11-year-old Chris, "Would Brian kill your dad?" He replied, "I don't know." They asked him, could Brian kill your dad? And again, he said, I don't know. Which was a very unusual response instead of the expected, no, he couldn't do it. No, he wouldn't do it. Well, Brian was eventually arrested and charged with taking his own father's life. But could they convince a jury of it with so little evidence? At the trial, the prosecutors laid out their case. 3 months earlier, they alleged Brian wanted a new car. So he may have set fire to his old one. But Leslie refused and offered to buy him a used car instead. They fought about this, his grades in school, and how he was ruining his chances of a college scholarship. According to Chris Vaughn, the two argued until 11:30 the night his father's life ended. They said Brian waited until Leslie was asleep, then woke his little brother up and took him to the neighbor's house. He told his neighbors he'd heard a noise from his dad's bedroom that sounded like a shot, and that he had already called the cops and was going back to the house to wait for the police to arrive. But Brian didn't realize that by going to the neighbors and making the call afterwards, that he'd been messing up his own timeline that he had created. Prosecutors believed he used that time to return home and pop his dad in the head to create the illusion of an intruder. Brian went out on the balcony and chucked a large rock at the window that he probably brought in from outside. The glass landed on top of Leslie's body, who didn't stir. Proof that this had happened after he was already gone. Evidence suggested Brian locked the bedroom door on his way out, then tracked the glass down the hallway to the bathroom where he'd gone to clean up. Then he disposed of the weapon and his stained clothing. Police still didn't know where, though. The defense claimed an unknown intruder had committed the crime, but the lack of evidence of any footprints below or on the balcony was a giveaway that the hitman had come from inside the house. Brian Vaughn was tried as an adult and found guilty. He received 33 years in prison and would be eligible for parole in 2017. While there was no official news of Brian being released, it is believed he won his parole because no longer does a Brian Leslie Vaughn exist anywhere in the prison system. And that is the insanely tragic and unbelievable case of Leslie Vaughn.